Welcome again to the Southwest Climate Podcast. Mike, Crimmins.
Zach, good to see you. It's April, right?
We apologize. We have failed our few listeners, which we really appreciate. It should be April. We were supposed to do one in April because our last one was March 11th. And we had a lot to talk about each month, but it was just really challenging to schedule. So here we are.
We got busy, but we're back.
You kind of look all googly-eyed. I think it's maybe the monsoon dew point or some copious amounts of coffee. But
it's my hair frizzing out with the dew point going up here.
This is the best time to do the podcast. So I'm really excited. I've missed the best day of my month, usually the last 2 months. So again,
I know I've missed you guys too. So I'm excited. We're back. We got a lot to talk about.
Just want to shout out to a number of people who were like, where is Mike Crimmins in the podcast? Which I took as a compliment because Mike, I like listening to you as well. No.
They said your name first.
I know.
Those emails.
Yeah, no. It was really great to hear people wondering what's going on. And, last time I do remember this, which I don't think we're actually going to get to, which is we ended the March 11th podcast being like, okay, in April, let's do a deep dive into the snowpack situation. So, but that's like, we got too much to cover and we don't want to make this like a 4-hour special.
Yeah.
So I think we're just going to punt on that, but maybe we'll talk a little bit about it later. We'll see how it goes.
Maybe we could just say that there wasn't much and it went away fast. So okay. I think we just took care of April.
Thanks for that. All right, Mike, I want to start this just with the question because I was, nobody really cares about me until the monsoon season comes around and then I get some media requests, so which is kind of funny. But I got this cool question on, which I'm sure you've thought about, and I just want to get your take. So what do you say when somebody says, what's unique about the Southwest climate? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I got a canned answer because I say this all the time when I, do presentations and teach around the region. And it's the thing that I love about Southwest is that we've got a seasonal climate. We transition between a very unique winter season where the weather is really interesting and specific to the Southwest, and it's shared by a lot of the rest of the Western US, but we have kind of our own sort of flavor and take on it. And then we've got these intervening dry seasons where it just doesn't rain, right? And that's what we just went through in the spring. La Nina was definitely part of that. But we do, Mays are not wet here, and that's pretty reliable. Sometimes they can be wet. And then we have this real stark transition into the monsoon season, which is completely different. So it's gets us to completely think about weather and climate differently. And you and I have been doing this now for over a decade, and we've kind of gone through that ebb and flow and that pulse of thinking about winter climate and then, reshuffling our brains as we get into the monsoon. And we think about monsoon for a couple months, and then we've got to actually think about how that's going to transition back into a weather pattern. And that you just don't see that, like Florida doesn't really have that. The Pacific Northwest doesn't have that. The Midwest, where I grew up, doesn't have that. So I think that's the really cool thing about about Southwest climate.
So when I was asked that question, I gave a similar answer. My answer was, it was a monsoon interview. So I highlighted the monsoon as being a really unique feature. And then I also talked about the number of different hazards, climate related hazards that the Southwest experiences. And after the conversation, I started thinking about that response a little bit differently. And up until the conversation, like June would have been, it's an easy month to villainize. I kind of said this before that it's my least favorite month, but then I was like, June is this special month actually. And I started thinking about June differently, right? Like you start talking about the monsoon, you start anticipating the monsoon. So even though June doesn't bring the monsoon for the most part, maybe just the tail end if we're lucky, it's still very much present in consciousness, right? But you also have like the apex of the fire season, right? You also have drought becomes a very entrenched and lingering part of the Southwest just because you've evolved from a really dry period of the year. So drought's there. It's also the height of the heat season, right? And water, the water supply issue is because we know at that point what sort of peak water will look like from the snowpack. So June is like the collision of all these things.
Yeah, it's cool. It's such a cool take because it's a dramatic month. It doesn't look like it on paper, or even maybe it does feel like it though. And I think that like just the way you talked about it is, if we think back the last couple of Junes, we had large fires burning across Arizona, and we don't this year, but New Mexico does. And so, it's like you said, that kind of, is it going to be us? Is it going to be somewhere else with that fire season? And then when does the Father's Day heat wave show up, right? Is it going to be on Father's Day? Is it going to be 2 weeks before? Is it going to be the week after? And we're already seeing those kind of conditions set up across the Southwest. And at the same time, it's entraining a little bit of moisture. So we're seeing the humidity go up. So yeah, it is very dramatic. That's a really good point.
So June has a high misery index, but it's also a fantastic month to talk about. So
absolutely, it's a top of the roller coaster for sure.
That's my new perspective on June. So welcome, June. All right, so we got a bunch to cover, Mike. So here's the outline. Let me know what you think. We can do the recap of the winter. Where did the winter rainfall and temperature rank? And just a hint to people that already know this, but it's pretty darn low. Pretty darn dry, in other words. That sort of take on June sort of inspired a hazard report. So let's unpack the fire, let's unpack drought, heat, and whatnot. So let's talk a little bit about the hazards. And then
let's get ready to rumble!
Yeah.
Your podcasting soundboarding is unmet and unmatched.
I know, this is a hack job.
It was pretty.
I thought that was funny though. Let's talk about the monsoon.
That's right.
Back. There's some good things to talk about. Even a hint, maybe the monsoon might start early. I kind of want to know if this is going to be a monsoon that might go streaking down I-10 again like he did 2 years ago. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, just a quick note to those people that don't make it to the end, but we are running back the Monsoon Fantasy Forecast game. So I'll be sending out emails. We'll be doing this on social media. We got some really cool prizes, better prizes this year. Last year, we gave out weather stations, 2 really cool weather stations, but didn't realize that not everybody that played would know what to do with them. So this year, we've got Amazon gift cards, which I think can resonate with everybody.
Where you can buy your weather sation. I mean, that's what I would do. So
that's true. For those that want a weather station, buy it there. Or, for me, you can buy diapers. Or
not for you though. You might want to clarify a little bit. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll have my wife play. No, family members can't win either. So we'll go over that at the end. So stick around. All right. So Mike, winter recap. Let me give the big picture and then turn it over to you to sort of tell us what the heck happened. So looking at the totality of the winter from November through May, looking at precipitation across the Southwest, pretty bleak picture. In fact, pretty bleak, from the Rockies west, with the exception of, parts of the Pacific Northwest, right? So in Arizona, we're in the bottom tercile, we're in the bottom 33rd percentile, except for a few small patches here and there in the Four Corners region. But I'm not even sure, there's great data coverage up there. So I'm not even sure how much I believe that, or maybe there's just like a one anomalous value. But anyway, by and large, the picture is below the 33rd percentile for most of Arizona, and actually for New Mexico as well. And even far eastern New Mexico, northeastern New Mexico experience its record driest 7-month period. So dry, not a lot of rainfall, snowpack. Probably to nobody's surprise, if you look at temperature, it's been much above average over that same period of time. So somewhere in the vicinity of, depending on where you are, 2 to 4 degrees above average for pretty much. Actually, if you want to look at the entire U.S., you have to go north of Wyoming and Idaho, and then from Central Oregon north, basically to get sort of average temperatures. Everywhere else in the U.S., the southern, let's say 2/3 of the U.S. is all much above average, with obviously the southwestern US being, like I just said, 2 to 4 degrees for the most part. So in my mind, Mike, like this sort of picture, particularly the rainfall, but also the temperature, can be explained by one of three things. And I'm curious which one. So it's either like we had few southeastern moving storms that dipped into our region. So we had fewer than what we normally would expect. Or we had kind of what we would expect or even more, but those storms just didn't tap into a subtropical moisture source. And so we didn't get rain despite having the storms move in, or some combination of both. So more or less, which one was it?
I think it's C. I think it was a combination of both. So this winter, and it really extends last fall through the rest of the spring, just kind of you pointed out, was our second La Nina winter. And we have seen very similar precipitation totals to the previous cool season of 2020, 2021. And so I don't think it's really been a surprise that this has been below average. And I think, as you kind of pointed out, it's been a mixed bag. This winter, this fall, winter, and into spring has been just slightly wetter than the previous year, but not enough really, I think, to make much difference. So I think we can kind of think of these as very, very similar, 2 really poor years in a row. I think you can kind of look back, and if you look back at a lot of the summaries and the discussions, we have La Nina fingerprints over both of these 2 years in a row. We have seen pretty decent troughing over the West, from time to time, so it wasn't as though we were just baking under a ridge like we've seen in past La Nina winters. If you think about like 2017, 2018, very, very warm, very long dry spells in that particular year, strong ridge of high pressure over the Western US. We were kind of up and down, right? But when we would get these systems come through, they didn't have a lot of moisture associated with them, and they wouldn't do a lot. And, thinking about like Arizona, our best run at precip since November was in December. And the previous year, our best run of wet conditions was in January. So if you line up the plots of cumulative precip for a couple of the cities, they look really similar, for Tucson in particular. They look really similar from 2020, 2021 in that cool season, and the same for this past year.
Yeah. So just to put some numbers to that. So 2 back-to-back very dry winters, like you said, in a row. 2021, so 2 years ago, was a little bit drier. At this day in 2021, we had like 1.5 inches in Tucson. We currently are at 2 inches.
Yeah.
The average is 5. Yeah. So right now, this year in Tucson, it's about 40% of average, which ranks in its record at the Tucson International Airport 5th driest. So last year was, top 5 too. This year's top 5 as well. Phoenix is about 50% of average this year. It's 11th driest in its record. Flagstaff was the big winner at it's running at about 70% of average, and that's the 21st driest. Albuquerque, about 28% of average, 4th driest on record. And Las Cruces, about 50% of average and 23rd driest. So yeah, not very good. And like you said, like our sort of main wet period this year was end of December, correct?
Yeah. So it was a little different for New Mexico. New Mexico kind of, if we, looking at Albuquerque's data right now, they've had evenly paced, but very, very small events. They had a decent run with some precipitation in the middle of March. That was one of those troughing events that actually was able to pick up a little bit of moisture. We have had a pretty active weather pattern across the West all fall, winter, and spring, but it's not been particularly effective at drawing up much moisture and creating a lot of precip for the Southwest. It's been really effective at creating windy conditions, though, once we got into April and May.
Does that have to do with the strength of the low that's moving down?
Yeah, and it's going to be the pressure gradient between the low itself and then the high pressure system to the south.
By the end of December in both Tucson and Phoenix, we basically had close to 90% of what, maybe even more of what we currently have now. So since from January, February, March, April, May into June, I mean, we just a couple maybe a quarter of an inch of rainfall in Tucson and slightly more in Phoenix. So that's a pretty protracted period. And we'll get to this because it has helped set the stage for higher risk for fire, which hasn't actually played out in Arizona, but certainly has in New Mexico, which we'll talk about. So yeah. So anything else with sort of where we are in terms of the synoptic weather system? I mean, like you said, like not really different than maybe we would have expected, given that we were sort of in a La Nina pattern. But La Ninas don't always unfold as we think they're going to, but this one certainly did.
They don't always look exactly the same with the subseasonal variability. This one had its own kind of maybe a little bit different flavor to it. And what stands out to me is there's some really good blog posts on climate.gov with the ENSO blog that was talking about the Pacific North America pattern, which is just one of those, it's an easy shorthanded way to look at the broad pattern that'll emerge, looking at the waves and the jet streams. And so we had some protracted periods of a negative P&A, which tend to be slightly more frequent during La Nina winters and springs. And those are where you get that trough of low pressure that will kind of park off the West Coast or come inland. And they can, if they've got some moisture to the south, drag it in, but they'll often just be kind of cool and windy. And I think that was really part of our whole thing that we dealt with the really windy conditions setting up in April and May across the Southwest. And it was really interesting because it looked really, really similar for a while there to 2011. And 2011 was that crazy windy year where we had huge wildfires across the Southwest, including Wallow, Horseshoe 2 in Southeast Arizona, and then the big fires that burned down large swaths of like Los Alamos, not Los Alamos, the town, but the big ones up near Santa Fe in 2011, in that spring of 2011.
What did 2011 look like in terms of rainfall? Do you have that handy? Like in terms of the rainfall pattern?
It was another La Nina winter. And remember, that was kind of part of the double dip La Nina too. So it was like a couple of La Nina winters in a row.
So that was the second one?
I think it was actually the first of two at that point, if I'm getting that right. Because 2009, 2010 was actually an El Nino winter. And then 10, 11, I can't quite remember, but I know 11, 12 we were getting into the double La Nina winters stacking up. And so we were into drought conditions then. There was some antecedent dryness. I don't know if it was quite as dry as what we've actually even seen this last couple of winters, but my guess is there's data on the internet that we could actually probably look at. And
okay. Is it characteristic that you have these long sort of the end of the season, if you will, or from the middle to the end of the winter as being fairly dry? Like, so we talked about last year, the main rainfall pulse came at the end of January, and this year it pretty much came at the end of December. And then you've got these like 3-4 months worth of pretty much rainless conditions or snowless conditions as well. So, I mean, is that pretty characteristic of these ENSOs, of these La Ninas, or is it really sort of highly variable? The bigger pattern is just that, like at the end of the season, the totals sort of come in below average.
It depends, because last spring, do you remember last spring, it actually started to rain and snow in northern New Mexico in May. And that was a La Nina situation too. So it's like, it's not super consistent. Like, climatologically, what we have is typically the winter season in the Southwest is it can start as early as November, and we can start to get mid-latitude storms drop into the region and bring some precipitation. Sometimes they can interact with subtropical moisture and do some good work down here. That can continue to persist through December, January. February, March can be really busy months with sort of the subtropical interactions. Like we get a split jet pattern, and that can bring in a lot of precipitation for Arizona and New Mexico, sometimes separately. And then we start to see the winter storm track recede north into April and May. And so climatologically, it's a little harder. We're harder pressed to get productive storms. So, one of the things about some of the climate change studies have kind of talked about the whole season sort of shrinking for the Southwest too, right? So the storms may come later, maybe more December, and they're going to stop sooner in March and maybe even retreat earlier than that. And so there's probably an ENSO interaction there with some La Nina, but it's not consistent. And the trend certainly has been that Aprils in particular have gotten drier over time with that progression of the jet stream north.
Got it. Woohoo, climate change.
Yay, no.
No, that's sarcasm.
So yes, sarcasm, please. Yes, it is super problematic.
Yeah, it's problematic for one of the things that we should talk about, which is, so let's move on. Let's think about let's talk a little bit about sort of the confluence of all of these hazards in June and late spring. I think one of the big stories this spring and summer has been the fire season in New Mexico in particular. But like, there's a broader question, right? Like, which is both Arizona and New Mexico have experienced pretty dry conditions. Like we talked about, warmer than average conditions. They haven't received, let's see here. Albuquerque, actually, if I'm looking at Albuquerque, like it did receive slightly more rainfall, like later in the season. Like there's a little bit, like a quarter of an inch or so in Albuquerque in mid-March, which might have helped. But then again, New Mexico has been the one that's been the bullseye. Its fire season has been historically bad. In fact, two fires that are still ongoing, but I think largely contained now. The Calf Canyon fire and the Hermit's Peak fire up in northern New Mexico. That's the largest on record, burning over 300,000 acres. And then there's the Black Fire, which is in the Gila forest, which is in southwestern New Mexico. It's burned close to 300,000 acres. So both of those now are number one and number two historically for the largest fires on record, which goes back to 1990. So not a huge record, but important nonetheless. So New Mexico has been the bullseye. Arizona, oddly, has been a much less vigorous fire season, thankfully. So I guess the question, Mike, is what gives? Is there any rhyme or reason to this sort of pattern or not so much?
I don't know. I'm kind of puzzling over it too. The fires in New Mexico, their biggest progression was weather driven, right? I mean, they really had trouble. They had strong resistance to control, as kind of said in the fire community, meaning that there were persistent days with extensive fire periods, meaning that the fires were burning through the night, so they would resist control at night, and they were wind driven, and that lasted for weeks, right? So that was part of the windy conditions in April and May that have largely subsided because the monsoon ridge is now building up into the southwest, and so as that does, the windy conditions are to the north now, and that pressure gradient is to the north. So I mean, Arizona saw similar conditions. The tunnel fire that occurred outside of Flagstaff in April, that fire burned from its point of origin, just raced to the northeast without any real safe attempt at control, and then it just kind of burned itself out because it ran out of fuel. It ran into the desert. We've had a lot of other fires. We've had grass fires that have quickly burned large areas and then were able to be controlled. And then we've had other fires that they've been able to kind of jump on really quickly and extinguish. So like there's been really pretty incredible firefighting. I mean, I think there's been incredible firefighting in New Mexico too, but it just seems like they're working with just slightly more extreme conditions as far as the wind, and probably the background dryness of fuels is even greater there than is in Arizona. Maybe that's the difference. I don't know. Maybe Arizona just got lucky this year and didn't have that right ignition at that right spot that was going to make, one of these fires grow to 100,000 acres.
Yeah. So for the people that like numbers, let me put some numbers to both Arizona and New Mexico. So the data that I'm looking from it's the Southwest Coordination Center, but what's the overarching agency that do you know offhand? NIFC.
Yeah, so Southwest Coordination Center is a geographic area coordination center. So they're called a YAC, and they're underneath NIFC, which is the National Interagency Fire Center.
Okay, so this is from NIFC pertaining to the Southwest region. And it's only looking at both Arizona and New Mexico, or their Southwest region combined. It's looking like that the total acres burned will be the third highest on its record, which goes back to 1990. So where we stand right now for Arizona is about 52,000 acres burned. I think its median is somewhere in the vicinity of it. I don't have these numbers exactly, but I think I'm pretty darn close. It's probably 180,000 acres. So way below the median there. New Mexico, on the other hand, has burned close to 840,000 acres, largely driven by those two that I mentioned before. And its median is less than Arizona historically. So yeah, it's been a rough fire season for New Mexico. And I should also mention that the Calf Hermits Fire Complex kind of took out 350 homes. So it was quite destructive in terms of damage. And you mentioned, which I don't have the data, but also the tunnel fire up in Flagstaff, I believe, destroyed a lot of property up there. So yeah, kind of a rough fire season. But hopefully that we're sort of nearing, well, we still have could be another month, right? Like the fire season doesn't end until the monsoon rains begin. So hopefully we will get some, early moisture to help quell it. That the humidity that wafted in, which we'll talk about in a little bit, certainly probably helped contain or suppress some of the fire activity that's ongoing. So that was nice.
Yeah, and I'm looking at some of the fire danger indices across the region here too, and it's interesting. We peaked at kind of maximum fire danger last month largely, and that's where the daily. This is from the National Fire Danger Rating System and looking at some of their indices, but they were at all-time maximum levels last month, and they've largely started to plateau, and that is because of humidity coming in. And climatologically in Arizona, we peak at kind of maximum fire danger right about the third week of June, and that's just what we were talking about earlier. Just the way you characterize June is you're building up to that, and then it's released by monsoon moisture coming in. And New Mexico is a little bit different because parts of New Mexico start to get spring moisture in a little bit earlier from the Great Plains. So the eastern side of the state can start to get humidity come in even a little bit earlier. And they have started to see thunderstorm activity up on parts of the Gila Mountains and then parts over northern New Mexico. And you're starting to see those fire danger indices come back down again. So I think we're as long as the humidity continues to flow in and we start to get a good solid start to the monsoon, we'll be in good shape. When that doesn't work is all you have to do is go back to 2020 to think about when that monsoon moisture doesn't show up and when your fire season is protracted.
Yeah, so let me clean up a few things with the actual data. Thanks to Ben for doing this in real time. So the tunnel fire took out 30 homes and 109 structures.
Wow, I had no idea that there was that many.
And then the median for Arizona over the 1990 to 2021 record is 166,000 acres. The average is close to 250,000 acres. So, there's been, a number of years with really large fires and a lot of acres burned, including like 2011, which you mentioned before, was close to 1 million acres burned in Arizona. That looks like it was the most severe on record. But just 2020, we had, 900,000, a little bit more than 900,000. So we've had some pretty recent large and intense fire seasons. New Mexico, median 100,000, and its average is close to 200,000. So again, a few years with some really large fires and expansive and intense fires. 2011, again, wow, 2011, both Arizona and New Mexico had New Mexico had over 1 million acres burned, and Arizona had close to 1 million acres burned. So
on that point too, Zach, I'll do a little cleanup on mine. I think I was close. 2010, 2011 was the first La Nina year. 2011, 2012 was the second. So that was the double dip, was those 2 years, and that followed the 2009, 2010 El Nino that we had.
Nice. Full value here. Okay, one other thing I wanted to talk about with fire. I'm just curious. So I was perusing the literature, came across a recent paper in Environmental Research Letters, which is a really good journal, titled Winter and Spring Climate Explains a Large Portion of the Interannual Variability and Trend in Western US summer fire burned area. It's a mouthful, as all titles are. This is a paper that's sort of like looking at the fire areas burned and trying to like answer the question, what's the climate signal in it? And one of the challenges of this is that, I mean, it's using as its data set a period in which there's a lot of sort of fire management's going on and like human ignition. So it's wrapping up all of those things, but still trying to like sort of control for these non-environmental factors and looking at the role of climate. So a couple of things that I found interesting. I'm curious about your take. One is, this may be not so new, but it was good for me to be reminded of it. But the paper says that a large fraction of the variability in acres burned, like 58% and even up to even close to 70% of the variability, depending on the different models that they use, are explained by climate conditions in the previous winter and in the current spring. So what I thought was interesting was, I mean, those were pretty darn high percentages. Is that surprising at all to you that those numbers are that high? Or is that sort of, no, we've known this for a long time, kind of a take?
Honestly, I only skimmed the paper. I think the novel contribution that was brought out was thinking more explicitly about snow, drought, and trying to make that connection about when there's less than average snowpack in certain regions and how that's an explanatory variable. This kind of work has been going on for a long time as far as the antecedent conditions. And I was actually, one of my dissertation papers got cited in that paper. And I built some of my work off of Tom Swetnam and Julio Bencourt's work, which is in the Southwest, thinking about the antecedent conditions prior to fire events. Is there any sort of like relationship between the previous winter being dry and the subsequent fire season being dry? And in the Southwest, what we actually find is there's two things going on, is that in fuel limited areas, you need to actually grow fuels with wet conditions, and then you need to dry them out to burn them. So that's the antecedent. If you get outside of the region, and this is work that Tony Westerling had done about 20 years ago, and then Jeremy Littell, I think is with the Forest Service or USGS, has done subsequently, is then look at the antecedent conditions. And what you find is across the West, you get outside of this region, is that it's different, right? Like what season needs to be dry to create the fire conditions is different. And that relates just to the background climatology of the particular locations. I think it's fairly straightforward in some respects, is that, you know, a lot of the fuel danger metrics are on fuel condition. And what we mean by that is how much moisture is in it. So if it's droughty in a region that has lots of fuel, you dry it out, you can subsequently increase fire risk. There are other studies, though, that suggest that another really important factor that drives the extent and the severity is actually the fire weather conditions that occur that's consistent with the antecedent conditions as well, right? So you can have extremely damaging large fire growth without having those antecedent conditions. And it was interesting, you brought up 2011. We thought about the Wallow fire. The Wallow fire that winter was actually near average to wet for parts of Arizona, even across the rim. And there was a little bit of a dry signal there. But you remember the previous year was 2009, 2010, which was very wet. And it was record snow in Flagstaff and along the Mogollon Rim. The Wallow fire was largely wind driven. If you remember those crazy epic winds that was driven. So that was somewhere it didn't really work out quite that well. And then the Rodeo Chetaskai fires on the other extreme, which was record long, hot conditions, dry spell. And the Rodeo Chetaskai fire had very little wind associated with it, but grew so hot it started to build its own weather and had all of those cumulus clouds that would build up and then collapse and then throw wind off in every direction, and kind of grew to large size because of antecedent fuel conditions. So yeah, this paper I think it's similar to previous studies. I think that contribution to maybe the snow interaction is there as well, but there's still a lot going on that happens in every fire season. That's this combination of antecedent conditions and concurrent conditions that leaves you with the ultimate outcome of that season.
Right. That's good. I want to pick up on that. It says that the relationships between burned area and pre-fire climate and snow drought variability reveals that the majority of the fire climate relationships can be explained through climatic preconditioning, and goes on to say that it sort of reinforces the idea that warmer and drier leads to or can contribute to more fire acres burned, but that there's a bunch of other stuff that's part of this. And this is where like the one sentence that I thought was like really instructive, because like people pick up on these studies in the mainstream media. It's an immediate pivot toward climate change and the impacts of climate change, obviously. But I think that there's an important line in here, and that line it says future long-term projections over the next century based on climate fire statistical relationships presented in this study should be interpreted as changes in climate's contribution to fire hazard rather than predictions of total area burned. And I think that's important. So they've got like really good statistical model, like pretty darn, like the variance explained is pretty darn high, like I mentioned before. But this idea of fire hazard rather than predictions of total area burned, because it sort of opens the door for the fact that there's other things going on, but more importantly, for me, that there's a role for mitigation and thinking about fire and its role in the landscape in a more sort of environmentally natural way.
Yeah.
Can do a lot of mitigation. So we're not locked into this. And this is where I think that the mainstream media sort of portrayal, there was even a recent article in New York Times on New Mexico's fire season that could have done this a little bit better, but its portrayal of like, we're locked in, like warmer conditions in the future, like definitely like precondition the area to have higher risk and higher hazard. But there's ways to mitigate that through being, more environmentally, whatever, intelligent, maybe is the right word, but managing fire in a different way. That's asking a lot, but I think that's an important nuance.
It is so complex too, because we got legacy of fire suppression and changes in fuel conditions, as well as the climate changing on top of it, as well as an enterprise of wildfire fighting, which is really critical and important, and is kind of interacting with these different things as well, right? And so, you can do all these thought exercises with like this current season in New Mexico, which unfortunately those large complexes actually had ties back to fuel mitigation activities, right? So prescribed fires that were either lost or a burn pile that re-erupted in the spring, so is there a climate change aspect to that? There could be, it could be because of some change in fuel condition or the expectation that burn pile would have been extinguished. It could have been La Nina. It could have been the interaction of warmer temperatures and La Nina drought conditions. Then you've got the wind of the spring, which was probably more connected with the La Nina pattern and that PNA pattern similar to 2011 that made a lot of these fires resistant to control. So it's really complicated, right? I mean, I think that's the real challenge, is since we're so intertwined with this from a management perspective that, what we're going to do into the future is absolutely recognize that, warmer temperatures are changing fuel conditions and changing fuel assemblages on the ground. But we also have legacy of suppression. So fuel treatments still do matter, and they'll matter into the future. And that wildfire fighting environment is changing as well. And so those warmer conditions can make fires, and this is what you've heard from firefighters, these fires are harder to control and become more dangerous. So it's kind of the interplay, I think, of both, and not simply one or the other.
Great. So there's only one other thing that I just want to mention, then we'll move on. But there's also a cool figure in the paper that breaks down sort of area burned by different sort of elevations and different forested types, like non-forested areas and forested areas, and shows the trends, like linear trends over time. And they're all slightly increasing, some more than others. But that's kind of just a cool data point. I mean, they're also trying to predict that. So they showed their predictions, which again is where the the variance explained numbers that I mentioned before come from, but there's actual data in here too, real data. So anything, I think we should move on from fire. Let's maybe hit the drought report just really quickly, see if there's anything that you want to say there. But just to note, looking at the US Drought Monitor, sort of we came into the winter season on after a sort of a pretty darn good monsoon season. So we had made up some ground, a little bit ground in the drought situation. At that point, Arizona, I mean, as common over the last 20 years, there's quite a bit of drought even, in November. Most of Arizona was at least moderately dry or more severe, but there wasn't any sort of exceptional drought. And there was a few areas that was just sort of in this abnormally dry. The drought monitor's like lowest category, if you will. I don't even think they call it a drought category, right? New Mexico was a slightly drier picture, some extreme drought in its northwestern corner, a little bit in Arizona too, but maybe a little bit more moderate, more severe and moderate drought than Arizona. So that was in November. Fast forward to where we are right now, June 7th, pretty much half of New Mexico is in exceptional drought. The other half is in extreme drought, so the two highest categories. And Arizona also descended, obviously, because it's been dry into more severe drought conditions for the most part across its entire state. So not unexpected given the rainfall and temperature picture that we presented before. Mike, is there anything that you want to note about maybe how the droughts evolved or anything there worth pausing on?
No, I mean, I think you wrapped it up nicely. The drought picture across Arizona and New Mexico it really came on strong. Well, it came on strong in 2020, after summer 2020. Prior to 2020, in spring of 2020, parts of the Southwest actually had done okay with winter precipitation. And there was still some Four Corners drought that was lingering even from previous years, 2017, 2018. 2020 just dropped us into those really deep, dark red categories. Subsequent winter, as we talked about, was very dry. And so we were, wall to wall in some of those deepest drought categories. 2021 monsoon, epic wet, and really in the corridor from like Phoenix to Tucson, parts of Southeast Arizona up through higher country of Arizona. Not as great as you went north and west, and okay in New Mexico. So the drought conditions, we didn't see a lot of relief. And so it's like you said, the abnormally dry conditions only really emerged in the drought monitor map where we had that near record or record rainfall. Then we went right back into drought conditions with La Nina. So they've actually started to close the donut hole of the abnormally dry around central Arizona. And so, we're just kind of backsliding. And so to see that open up again, we need epic monsoon rainfall to return.
So, last year at about this time, we were talking about how much pressure was put on the upcoming last monsoon, because we were in a very sort of dry situation. Last year, June 8th, exceptional drought was probably covering half of Arizona. And like I said, very little, actually, there is a little sliver in Northwest Arizona that has exceptional drought, but it's just a small part. The reverse is for New Mexico. New Mexico was in a better state last year in terms of the more extreme and exceptional droughts. And this year it's a worse situation than last year. So I suppose we should probably have that same sort of conversation for New Mexico. We're in a little bit of a better situation for Arizona, but I think that sets the stage. And of course, obviously this relates to the fire conditions that we just talked about. So
yeah, absolutely. That's right.
So I guess we'll see how the drought unfolds with the monsoon, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, Mike, so moving right along, the heat season, our hazards report for the heat season. I just pulled up two figures, courtesy of our good friend Paul Inez, pronouncing that right. Yeah, thank you. National Weather Service in Phoenix, looking at the number of days above 100 in Phoenix and Tucson. He started doing this in 2020, which was the most on record. And this year, so right now for Tucson, we've experienced 14 days, and that's above average. So I think I'm sort of eyeballing this. Average looks like it's about 10. We're not close to the record. The record was 19 in 1988 and 18 in 2020 for Tucson. So, but we're above average. And then Phoenix, 21 so far, and 2020, 1989 had at this time 31. That was the record. At the end of the year, 2020 again was the year that had the most number of days above 100 in Phoenix at 145. Whereas Tucson 2020 was 108. So yeah. So the heat season, are we going to have that? You sort of opened this with, are we going to have that Father's Day? When is Father's Day, by the way?
A week from Sunday. How old is Ellis now?
He's a little over 2.5.
Oh, he should definitely get you something.
Yeah, I'll make sure he knows.
Okay.
We usually get a heat wave, right? Like the last couple of days have been pretty hot, but not the heat wave that we've had in the past. So what's on the horizon? Mike, are we going to get the heat wave before the monsoon starts? Because the heat wave happens usually in June.
We're under excessive heat warnings for much of Arizona right now. So that's through the weekend. Yeah, heat advisories and excessive heat warnings. Yeah, really wall to wall from Arizona to New Mexico coming up. And that's with this, ridge of high pressure that's associated with the whole monsoon ridge sort of building up over the Southwest. So it's how long the ridge persists, kind of where it sets up and the intensity of it. And we're going to be under one right now, for this weekend and into early next week. It looks like the weather pattern, though, it's pretty noisy over the next couple of weeks. At least this is what models are suggesting, where we've got low pressure systems still zipping across to the north of us. And what that does is it tends to flatten the ridge, push the moisture out of here, and temporarily cool us down and dry us out. So we might be up and down for the next couple of weeks, which really is about the monsoon onset. It's like the more that happens, the further off you start to put that kind of solid monsoon onset on the table.
All right, let's do it.
Let's get ready to rumble!
How does that not fire you up?
That's why they put it in Space Jam. I mean,
or before a boxing match.
Yeah, I always remember it. Wasn't it? It was in the beginning of basketball games, and I thought I remember it in wrestling on TV too.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's all.
Yeah.
But I remember it when I used to watch boxing during the Mike Tyson era. I remember.
Oh, right. Yeah.
All right. So the monsoon, it's here. Well, it's here in the sense of we're now we can.
It's on the calendar.
Talk about it without feeling like we're wishing for it to be June. Something like that. All right. So last night I actually opened my radar scope app because it looked monsoony, and on that app there were cells. There were a number of them. There was outside my back door. There was a bunch of wind gusts. There was like dark conditions on the horizon. Like my swamp cooler I had to shut off because the humidity burst up. And then Twitter is ablaze with. So the CPC, I guess we should say this: the Climate Prediction Center had on their 8 to 10 and 10 to 14 day forecast, painted slightly increased chances for rainfall, above average rainfall in those forecast periods. And, everybody's the monsoon's going to start early. And, it certainly could be that way, Mike. So what's your feeling on this? Obviously the monsoon hasn't started. It was a prelude, right? Last night, but where are we?
It's what is the beginning of the monsoon? Right. I mean, this goes back to the whole dew point definition sort of arguments and using that as a convention of a start. What we're seeing, I think, is really promising. It's a good, solid ramp up of figuring out how to get moisture from the south into the Southwest. And so the Weather Service has been talking about this in their discussions over the last couple of weeks, how Mexico has had really good, solid kind of afternoon thunderstorm activity along the Sierra Madre. And so that's kind of the foundation, right, of building the whole sort of progression of the North American monsoon precipitation into the Southwest. So it's not like they were falling behind. It's like they were on schedule. So we're just kind of in the queue as this whole thing progresses north. So the last couple of days, the ridge was sloppy and kind of building over the west. There was a little bit of some upper level low pressure system activity too, which enhanced some of this too. So we ended up having kind of a weak surge of moisture up the Gulf of California in Arizona. So dew points, they went up. We had some outflows come out of Mexico and create a little bit of instability. Instability is always better over the mountains. So fired off some storms. They wandered around yesterday. They did put down some really good precip in Douglas, Arizona, and Sierra Vista, so right along the border, which is kind of where you expect it to start. Still really pretty early. I'm not convinced, and it certainly looks this way on the models, is that this is not the start. And when I think of start, I think of like we're at the beginning of the persistent afternoon cycle that will, and we're in the soup till we get to the end of, the middle of September.
Do you remember a couple of years ago when we were sort of fooling around with naming, like there was like an early onset or I don't know if it was the onset of the monsoon, but we were calling it the too soon. Do you remember?
That? Yeah.
Was that similar to what was, do you recall?
Well, we had a couple of summers and they all blur together to me, is that we had precip in like the first 2 weeks of June. They were actually tropical storm remnants that wandered up here.
So different than what we just.
Yeah, this isn't really, it doesn't have any really, I don't think it was tropical origin. It was just, kind of interaction with some weather features. And again, I think good solid stuff that was occurring in Mexico. So I think that's what's a little bit different, is that there's been good activity. It's been building north. The problem with June is that you're fighting still these sort of late season spring storms that are still kind of moving across the northern part of the Western US, right? And what you really need to have happen is that those continue to retreat north. The trough that occurs over the Pacific needs to sort of retreat off to the West Coast. And we need to be under a broad ridge of high pressure. Four corners high, man. You need that. We need to be in the upper level easterly, mid-level easterly wind flow for it to be kind of true monsoon conditions. And this last couple of days, we've had winds out of the southeast, but they haven't been because of a good, well-positioned high pressure system. You'd see sort of a traditional kind of monsoon flow.
But there are a couple of good signs, right? Like you said, the rainfall in the Sierra Madres, quite a bit of moisture recycling fuels the monsoon. So it's good to lay down some soil moisture early. So that's kind of a promising start. Like we're not quite like, if one of the metrics for like the persistent onset of these storms is the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of California, and that we're kind of like not at this magical. They're not warm enough. I think they're. Mike, do you remember what that sort of paper that talked about like sort of a threshold, though? I think it was like 29C, or was it?
Yeah, it's in the upper 20s. Yeah, I'm looking at the analysis right now, and they're not super warm. And the reason that's important is because you get this sort of threshold where the instability is uncapped, and you can actually give off a lot of that moisture to the atmosphere, and it's able to flow up. And it's associated with that sort of reversal in wind, where you're getting the wind to blow up the Gulf of California, and that kind of increases the temperature there. It's kind of a mishmash right now, and it's early. It happens fairly quickly through June, but it's still pretty early. Right. So your ability to really generate good deep surges, I think, is somewhat limited when those waters are still kind of cool. But again, that will change. It's just, I think I'm not trying to poop on anything right here. I'm just trying to say, like, you don't typically get into solid monsoon conditions very early. Remember, on the old dew point definitions that we used to use for Tucson, it was like June 17th was the earliest where you got into like the solid 54-degree dew point days, if that's useful to think about. So it's June 10th right now. The official monsoon season start with the Weather Service is June 15th. So we'll cross that next week. Then, we should be vigilant for that, but I still expect that we're still a couple of weeks off of what we'd start to say, like, yeah, like we're in it.
Well, I also think part of the optimism is like, it is a similar sort of tropical Pacific Ocean setting as it was last year. Like, we're in this La Nina event, and there is some like lean toward like earlier onsets during La Nina. Like it's not super strong, but it happened last year. So there's maybe a little bit of the La Nina, glasses on at the moment with a dash of wishful thinking. But of course, the CPC is sort of forecasting in the shorter upcoming 2 weeks, 3-week periods. They are sort of tilting the odds. But interestingly, their official forecast, right, for July, August, and September 3-month season is sort of a shrug. It's a sort of an equal chances forecast. So they're not indicating. But I will say this: if you do get an early onset of a monsoon in a particular region, it usually correlates with an above average rainfall season, just in part because you're adding a few more days of rainfall to the season. So maybe that bodes well. But I don't know, Mike. What's your take on an early start? Like I mean, I don't know if I want to put you on the spot because I think I know your answer, but how do you feel about this monsoon season?
It's so interesting. We still don't have a ton to go on. Just like you said, the correlations are there from the past, but with all correlations, the causation is a little fuzzy. And even with that, when we kind of understand mechanism, the correlations aren't one, right? So I think the La Nina, from Chris Castro's work, we've got some indication that La Ninas tend to favor early onset. They don't always, though. And even like you said, too, the La Nina summers they're not wet every month all the time as well, right? And so I'm cautiously optimistic. I kind of feel like we're going to have an on-time start and maybe some good solid activity through July. I'm a little bit worried about August and September. And part of this is borne out with the models, the dynamical models, which again aren't great and can't put a lot of weight on them. A lot of them are interesting that they're not that bullish on even a wet July. Like there's kind of a mixed bag. As you were mentioning part of the podcast, that National Multi-Model Ensemble, the NMME, which is what we look at a lot, and a lot of the forecasters, the Climate Prediction Center, are using, the July, August, September forecast is actually not that rosy for Arizona and especially for New Mexico. Eastern New Mexico is like they're not bullish at all.
I mean, it's not rosy at all. If you look
it's like below average, right? For the July, August,
all
September.
of the models in this North American multi-model ensemble.
Yeah.
And there's, a couple US, a couple Canadian, NCAR, NASA, NCEP, GFDL. None of them actually have a wetter signal. They all have a dry signal. This is what I find interesting.
Yeah.
But if you go to the International Multi-Model Ensemble, which I don't know what they're drawing on, but obviously the European, right? The European models. But the International Multi-Model Ensemble does have an above average rainfall signal for the far southeastern corner of the U.S., but also up through the Sierra Madre Occidental. So
yeah, it's interesting. So the IMME, the International Multi-Model Ensemble, like you said, is the more optimistic. And there's recent research out too that suggests that the European Center, the ECMWF model, is skillful and seasons out ahead of some of the general characteristics of the monsoon season that can lead to above average precip. And in general, the skill of these European Center models tend to be better than the suite of the US. So we can use that as maybe like a little bit of optimism. And it's just what you said. It really is hugging. It's kind of a southern, southeast Arizona, southern New Mexico signal that'll probably reach up through the high country as well because of just the way the monsoon works. So I'm kind of cautiously optimistic at this point. I was thinking about last summer too. There's two events that occurred last summer that made up most of the precip, right? And it was that really strange retrograding low pressure system that happened in the third week of July which is, like we talked about it. We had seen that in 2006. So they're not happening every monsoon season. They're certainly not happening every La Nina monsoon season. And it happened again in August. So it happened twice. And that's what made last summer so epically wet. So what are the chances of that happening again this summer, even once?
No, people have asked me for my forecast, right? Because that's the question that everybody wants to know. It's like, what's the going to be like? And I'm like, well, I can tell you almost to I bet my house on it and my cat that it's not going to be as wet as in Tucson. It won't be as wet as it was last year. So I feel pretty confident that, last year was historically wet.
Yeah.
What did it come in? Third or second?
It was third.
It'd be amazing. And maybe I wouldn't bet my cat.
Your kid didn't go in there, right? I didn't hear kid, then cat, right? And you swapped out.
I said
you left kid in there and you took cat out. Okay. I just want to make sure.
Yeah. I bet my house.
Okay. Yeah. It's like, if you look historically too, back-to-back wet years are not super common as well. 1954, 1955 with Tucson one of those was I think 1954 was one of the top 3 wettest years. And then 55 was actually a pretty good monsoon as well. And that actually, it was a string of La Nina years that was associated. So there's like some probably connection here, but it's weak. And it's because of the evolution of the monsoon season can be it can be on the whims of some of these larger scale organizing events.
What we didn't get last year, though, that's probably maybe just by virtue of chance, like increases the odds this year, is we didn't get much decaying remnant tropical storms in September.
Yeah, and we didn't last year. We haven't for several years now, and it's largely been because of La Nina. Like the outlook for the East Pacific hurricane season is below average, like it was last year. And if you remember last year, by the 15th, 16th of August, we were kind of done. We had a tropical storm make a little bit of precipitation across Southwest right at September 1st. And then that was effectively the last really kind of monsoon proper precipitation. And we got more precip at the end of September, but it was really early fall, kind of winter, quote unquote, even though it's 100 degrees out weather at that point.
That precip at the end of September shook up the winners.
It did. That's right. Yeah.
Which we'll talk about right now, but I want to say one other thing, just a shout out to La Nina, since you mentioned it. Something to keep an eye on as we go forward. It is looking like we might get a triple dip La Nina, at least into the early part of the winter. So chances are, the forecasts are saying that those cold conditions in the East Pac are going to persist. So we'll have to keep an eye out on that.
What about Fantasy Enso? Are we gearing up?
No, but let's pivot, because hopefully we'll still get the same kind of excitement from people. But we had a lot of fun last year turning the question on to you all and asking, well, what do you think the monsoon's going to be like? And we set up this platform where, across the Southwest, you get to put your forecasts for the months. Each month you do it ahead of that month, and you accumulate points based on how accurate your forecast is compared to observations at the airports in Tucson, Phoenix, Flagstaff, Albuquerque, and El Paso. You get to make your forecast at those 5 cities, accumulate points based on how accurate your forecast is in comparison to observations. But you also score total points based on the riskiness of your forecast. So you've got to play those 2 levels. Like if you go whole hog, and if you were to bet like, oh, it's going to be 8 inches of rainfall in July for Tucson, which nobody did last year. What was it last year? It was close to that, right? It was.
Yeah.
You would have scored the maximum points that you can get because it was such an unlikely forecast. So you're playing with accuracy and riskiness. So we're excited to see what you guys forecast. We got a couple cool prizes. Like I said at the beginning, a $400 Amazon gift card for the winner, a $300 for the second place, and a $200 for the third place. We're not gonna, even if we win, and Ben almost won last year, we're ineligible.
This is new to me, so we'll just have to have this conversation offline. So,
well, you were pretty bad last year.
I was terrible. Yeah.
There's one major change that we did, which is last year we made it so that you had to make your forecast a week prior to the start of the month, right? And we did that because we didn't want people looking at the forecast and the weather forecast, and then, using that, figuring that into their monthly forecast. But we sort of got rid of that, and you can make your forecast now up until basically the day, the turn of the day. So like you can make your forecast for July up until 11:59 on June 30th, and so forth for making your forecast for August and making it for September. So, and one other thing I should say is, in order to qualify for the prizes, you have to play at least 2 months. So yeah, we're just curious and have fun with it. And last year was really, really interesting to talk with the winner, who had just moved here from the Midwest. And like I said, everything changed on the last day, as I think it was both Albuquerque and El Paso got rainfall and shook it all up. So yeah, I don't know, Mike, do you have a good time with that last year? What do you think?
I did. I mean, I'm going to just go with climatology again this year, because eventually if I play overtime, it'll work out for me.
Yeah, you got to play it over 10 years.
Exactly right.
I don't know what my strategy is going to be, but I think my strategy is going to be, I'm going to hedge toward above in the beginning and hedge toward below in the latter months.
That's my gut take too. Yeah.
But yeah, so Monsoon Fantasy Forecast, let's run it back.
Let's do it.
Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll come back at you as soon as we can.
Happy monsoon. Man, that's a lot of podcast.
Ben, if you just like cut out most of my babbling, we can knock it down to an hour. Las Cruces, I think it is. I don't think it's El Paso. I think it's Las Cruces.
Yeah, that's right.
It's El Paso.
We were both wrong.
So just say "and El Paso" in a natural way, and I'll splice it in.
And El Paso, and El Paso, and El Paso. Should I play the "Let's Get Ready to Rumble" one more time?
Yeah.
Let's get ready to rumble!
So good.
It is good. It is.